The first time I heard about Ouranopithecus, I was sitting on a dusty stone wall outside my uncle's house, looking at the hills that curved away into the horizon. Those hills weren't big, but they looked old. Not just my grandpa's old, but older than the town, older than the language we spoke, maybe older than the rivers. My uncle always said the land remembered everything, even the things people had forgotten. It was late summer, and the heat felt heavy enough to crush the air. The grass was dry and yellow, and cicadas sang like tiny machines hidden in the rocks. My cousin Tarek was playing with marbles on the dirt, and I was trying to decide if I should help him or keep staring at the hills, when my uncle came walking up the path with a man I didn't recognize. The stranger wore a white hat and carried a big leather bag. His clothes were dusty, and his boots were so covered in dirt they almost looked carved out of stone. He had that look people get when they're searching for something, eyes always scanning, hands twitching like they're already ready to grab whatever they find. "This is Professor Marcos," my uncle said, resting a hand on my shoulder. "He studies very old animals." "Not animals," the professor corrected, but he smiled while saying it. "Ancestors. I'm looking for traces of a creature that lived here millions of years ago. Its name is Ouranopithecus." The word felt strange in my mouth when I tried saying it quietly. It sounded like something from a spell book. Tarek rolled his eyes. "What's that supposed to be? Some dinosaur?" Professor Marcos knelt down so we were at the same height. "Not a dinosaur. Much younger than that. But also, not that young. Ouranopithecus was a kind of ape, big jaws, strong teeth, and maybe, just maybe, the start of what would one day become, you." I laughed, because how could some old ape be connected to me? But the professor didn't seem like he was joking. We followed him to the foot of the hills later that afternoon. The sun was slipping down, and the air had that gold-orange glow that makes everything look like a painting. There was a spot where the ground was cracked open, a dry stream bed lined with stones that glittered faintly in the fading light. "This is where we found part of a jaw last year," Marcos said, crouching down. "Big teeth, flat on top, good for crushing tough plants. Bigger than chimpanzee teeth, but shaped a bit like ours." He opened his bag and took out a plaster cast of the jaw. It was heavy looking, with 3 wide teeth and part of the bone still attached. I touched it without thinking, and the surface was cold, even though the day had been hot. For a moment, I imagined it was still inside the mouth of the creature, chewing leaves under the shade of some tree that didn't exist anymore. 3 million years old, I guessed. Marcos shook his head. "Try 9 million. The number made my mind spin. I couldn't even imagine 100 years, and here he was talking about 9 million. As we walked deeper into the hills, he told us what he thought Ouranopithecus might have been like. It wasn't small like a monkey, but not as big as a gorilla. It probably walked on all fours most of the time but could sit upright to eat. Its face had a heavy brow, its nose was broad, and its eyes, he said, might have looked almost human. But the most important thing, Marcos said, stopping to point at the ground, is that they lived here. Right here, in this land, long before there were villages, cities, or even people. I looked around at the dry grass, the rocks, the empty sky. It was hard to believe anything had lived here except goats and lizards. But Marcos said that back then, it had been different. There were more trees, and the air was cooler. Rivers ran where now there was only dust. Herds of antelope-like creatures grazed in the distance, and saber-toothed cats prowled the edges of the grass. And somewhere among them, Ouranopithecus climbed trees and cracked open seeds with its powerful jaws. We reached a slope where the soil had a strange red color, and the professor stopped to scrape at it with a small pick. He worked slowly, almost like he was afraid of hurting the dirt. Then, after a few minutes, he called us over. In the earth, half covered by dust, was something pale and curved. At first, I thought it was just another stone, but when he brushed away more soil, I saw it was smooth in a way stones aren't. Bone. Could be a fragment of a cheekbone, Marcos murmured. His hands moved carefully, brushing, scraping, brushing again. He didn't pull it out right away. He explained that fossils are fragile, and if you just grab them, they can break. You have to free them like you're waking something from a deep sleep. I crouched close, watching every movement. The thought that this small piece of bone had been part of a living thing millions of years ago made my chest feel tight. What happens if you find the whole skull? I asked. He smiled faintly. Then we'll know more about who they were. We'll be able to see their face well, almost. Bones don't tell us everything. But they whisper. I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but later I would. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. While Tarek snored in the next bed, I lay awake, imagining the land 9 million years ago. I pictured tall green trees where now there was only dry grass. I imagined the sound of running water and the calls of strange birds I'd never seen. And in the middle of it all, I imagined a figure not quite human, not quite animal moving slowly through the shadows. Maybe it was curious. Maybe it was looking for food. Maybe, for a moment, it paused and looked around, just like I had from the stone wall earlier that day. The professor had said they might be part of our story, even if we didn't know exactly how. That idea lodged in my head like a pebble in a shoe, small, but impossible to ignore. The next morning, we went back to the hillside. The professor had brought more tools and a small folding table with brushes, plaster, and bags for samples. My uncle helped dig, while Tarek and I carried buckets of soil away from the site. By midday, the fragment from yesterday was fully exposed. It was larger than I'd thought, part of the cheek, part of the eye socket. Marcos wrapped it in plaster bandages, then wrote on it with a marker, the date, the location, the depth. He said every detail mattered. Without them, the bone was just a strange rock. With them, it was a piece of history. When we asked him how he knew where to dig, he tapped the side of his head. You look for patterns, he said. Layers in the earth, the color of the soil, the kinds of stones nearby. The land speaks, but you have to learn its language. I thought about that while I shoveled. I wondered how many secrets were still buried under my feet, how many stories had been erased by time but could still be told if someone knew where to listen. That evening, as we packed up, Marcos turned to me and asked, "Do you want to see the place where I think the rest of the skeleton might be?" Of course I did. We hiked a little farther up the slope, past a ridge where the wind blew in sharp bursts. The ground here was scattered with fragments of stone that glittered faintly in the low light. Marcos knelt and picked one up. It was dark and shiny, almost like glass. Volcanic rock, he said. This whole area was shaped by ancient eruptions. Sometimes that kind of event buries things fast and keeps them safe for millions of years. He pointed to a spot where the soil dipped in a shallow bowl. That's where we'll dig next. If we're lucky, we might find something that changes how we understand the story of Ouranopithecus and maybe the story of us. I didn't know it yet, but that spot would become the place where I first truly felt the pull of the past, the strange mix of wonder and responsibility that comes with holding history in your hands. The next day began before the sun. I woke to the sound of footsteps outside and the smell of tea drifting in from the kitchen. My uncle was already dressed, tightening the straps of a canvas bag, while Professor Marco stood at the doorway sipping from a tin mug. His wide hat rested on the table, and his eyes were fixed on the faint blue line of the horizon where the hills waited. "Up early," he said when he saw me rubbing my eyes. I nodded, though really I hadn't slept much. The thought of the bone we'd found yesterday and the promise of the spot higher up the slope had kept my mind buzzing all night. Tarek grumbled when I shook him awake, but he got up anyway. By the time we set out, the air was still cool and the sky pale with the first light. We hiked in silence for a while, the dry grass brushing against our legs. A thin mist clung to the lower ground, making the hills look like islands in a white sea. Somewhere far away, a goat bleated. When we reached the bowl-shaped dip in the slope, the professor crouched and traced his hand across the ground. The soil here was darker than the places we dug before, reddish-brown, almost like powdered rust. "This layer," he said, tapping it with his fingers, "is about 9 million years old. Below it, we find older things. Above it, younger. It's like the pages of a book, except the book is written in stone." He unpacked his tools, small trowels, brushes of different sizes, thin metal picks, a magnifying glass. Tarek and I each got a flat blade scraper and a small bucket. Our job was to clear the top layer without disturbing anything buried inside. The work was slow. Dust puffed up around us with every scrape, and the sun climbed higher until the shadows vanished. My arms started to ache, but I kept going, because every time the scraper slid across something that felt different, harder, smoother, my heart jumped. Around midday, it happened. I was clearing a patch near a chunk of volcanic rock when my scraper snagged on something that wasn't soil. I brushed at it gently, and a pale curve emerged. At first I thought it was another small stone, but when I touched it with my fingertips, it felt almost too smooth, as if time had polished it. "Professor!" I called. He came quickly, kneeling beside me. His eyes lit up when he saw the curve. "Good eyes," he said softly. "That's bone." He took over, using a small brush to reveal more. Slowly, the curve connected into another, and then another, until a shallow hollow appeared. "Eye socket," he murmured. "This could be part of the skull." I felt a strange shiver. A skull. That meant a face. A creature that had lived and breathed long before any human had walked here. The professor didn't rush. He explained that bones buried this long become fragile, almost like thin stone. If you try to lift them too soon, they can crumble. First, you have to free them completely, then strengthen them with a thin liquid. He called it a consolidant that seeps into the bone and hardens it. Only then can you lift it without destroying it. For the rest of the day, we worked slowly around the find. Every scoop of soil had to be checked. Every angle had to be cleared before moving on. By the time the sun dipped low, the hollow of the eye and part of the cheekbone were visible. I could almost imagine where the brow ridge would be. "We'll cover it tonight," Marcos said, laying a cloth over the exposed bone. "Better to protect it from the wind. Tomorrow, we'll see more." That night, I sat on the stone wall again, watching the sky turn purple and red. My uncle sat beside me, sipping tea. "You're quiet," he said. I shrugged. "I keep thinking about it. That skull. Do you think, if we find the whole thing, we'll know exactly what our Ouranopithecus looked like?" My uncle smiled. "Maybe. But bones only tell part of the story. The rest comes from the land around them, what they ate, where they slept, who hunted them. You can't understand a person or an ape by just their face. I thought about that for a long time. The next morning was hotter. The mist was gone, replaced by sharp sunlight that made the stones glare. We returned to the dig site and began again. As the professor brushed away more soil, more of the skull appeared, the brow ridge, strong and wide, the curve of the jaw, the base where the spine would have connected. It's not a full skull, he admitted, but it's more than I expected. And it's definitely Ouranopithecus. How can you tell? Tarek asked. Jaw shape, brow ridge, size of the teeth. See here. He pointed to a flat, wide molar still lodged in the bone. Perfect for grinding tough plants. Chimps have narrower ones. Gorillas are even bigger, but their skull shape is different. This is somewhere in between. He paused, then added, somewhere on the road toward us. That phrase stuck with me. On the road toward us. It was strange to think that our story, the story of humans, didn't begin with people at all. It began with something that wasn't quite human, but wasn't entirely like any animal alive today either. Something that lived in a different world, faced different dangers, ate different food, yet still carried the first tiny spark of what we would become. The professor explained that Ouranopithecus might have walked on the ground more than other apes of its time, maybe because forests were shrinking and open grassland was spreading. That meant they had to watch for predators in a new way, maybe stand upright for a moment to scan the horizon. They didn't know it, he said, but they were adapting in a way that would eventually lead to us. I imagined one of them standing in tall grass, peering over the top, the wind moving its fur, the sun in its eyes. For a second, I saw my own shape in its shadow. We spent the rest of the week carefully removing the skull fragment and packing it in plaster. The professor would send it to a lab for study, but before it was wrapped, he let me hold it for a moment. It was heavier than I expected, but not in weight, in meaning. My fingers traced the curve of the eye socket, the edge of the jaw. This had been alive once. It had seen things, heard things, maybe even thought things we could never know. When I handed it back, I felt like I was giving away something important, even though I knew it wasn't mine. By the end of the week, we had also found pieces of ribs, part of a femur, and several teeth scattered nearby. They might all belong to the same individual, or they might be from others who lived and died here. One evening, as we packed up, the professor stood at the edge of the slope, looking out over the hills. You know, he said quietly, the thing about fossils is, they're not just bones. They're messages. They tell us who came before, and maybe even where we're going. I asked him if we'd ever find the whole story. He shook his head. Probably not. But every piece is a whisper. And enough whispers can sound like a voice. That night, I dreamed of the hills again, not as they are now, but as they were then. I saw tall grass bending in the wind, rivers winding between green slopes, herds of strange animals moving like shadows. And there, in the middle of it all, Ouranopithecus turned its head and looked straight at me. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Somehow, I understood, I was here before you. And because I was, you are. The morning after we wrapped the skull fragment in plaster, the wind changed. It came from the west, sharp and dry, rattling the brittle grass like 1,000 small drums. Professor Marco said weather like this could strip away soil and expose new layers, so we packed our bags quickly and headed back to the hills. The bowl-shaped dip where we'd been digging was quiet. The plaster-wrapped skull lay in its crate, ready to be sent away, but the professor didn't go near it. Instead, he walked to the far edge of the slope, where the ground slanted into a shallow gully. "Here," he said, pointing to where the soil was already peeling away. "When the wind cuts into a hillside, it sometimes uncovers things you'd never notice otherwise." We followed, stepping carefully over loose stones. The gully was lined with dark rock on one side and softer reddish earth on the other. In the wall of soil, small pale shapes jutted out, pieces of bone, no bigger than a finger. At first, I thought they were just scraps, leftovers from some animal that had died there long ago. But as we brushed them free, more appeared, lying almost in a line. The professor's eyes narrowed. "This might be a scatter site," he said. "That means bones from more than one individual, maybe washed here by water or buried after some event." "What kind of event?" Tarek asked. Marcos shrugged. "A flood, a mudslide, maybe even the collapse of a riverbank. In places like this, nature does the burying for us." I crouched beside a small piece of bone that looked like part of a rib. It was curved and smooth, and when I ran my finger over it, I felt a faint ridge. It was strange to think that this tiny fragment had once been part of something breathing, moving, alive. We worked for hours, uncovering more fragments, ribs, a piece of pelvis, and several teeth. The teeth were the most fascinating. Some were worn flat, like they'd chewed hard plants for years. Others were sharper, less used, maybe from younger individuals. The professor lined them up on a cloth and studied them. "This," he said, pointing to one of the larger molars, "belongs to an adult male. And this smaller one could be from a female or juvenile. So they lived together?" I asked. He tilted his head. "Probably. Many primates live in groups: gorillas, chimpanzees, baboons. It gives protection from predators and helps with finding food. Ouranopithecus might have done the same." That idea stuck in my mind. I began to imagine a small group moving through the tall grass, adults watching for danger, younger ones playing or clinging to their mothers, all of them following the smell of ripe fruit or the sound of running water. After lunch, the professor decided to follow the gully farther uphill. The sun was hot now, baking the soil so it cracked under our boots. We stopped at a spot where the gully narrowed into a steep cut. "This layer here," Marcos said, pointing at a band of pale sand between two darker layers, "is probably the bed of an ancient river. If Ouranopithecus came here to drink or gather food, we might find more than just bones." "Like what?" Tarek asked. "Seeds, bits of wood, maybe even stone tools, though it's unlikely for something this old. But we could find the remains of animals they lived alongside." That was exciting in a different way. Bones of Ouranopithecus told us about them, but bones of other creatures would tell us about their world. We scraped at the pale sand carefully. It was softer than the red soil and came away in thin layers. Before long, I spotted something dark against the light background. I brushed gently, and a tiny fragment of wood appeared, dark brown, almost black, hardened by time. The professor examined it with his magnifying glass. "Petrified wood. From a tree that grew here millions of years ago. Likely part of the forest edge where Ouranopithecus fed." Tarek found a small tooth nearby, pointed and sharp. "Carnivore," Marcos said immediately. "Probably a small cat, maybe related to the ancestors of leopards." I pictured that an ancient forest edge, with apes in the trees and cats moving silently in the grass below. Every sound would have mattered. Every shadow could have been danger. As the day wore on, we began finding more evidence of a wider community of life: the leg bone of a small antelope-like animal, fragments of turtle shell, and more petrified wood. It was like the land was opening a window just wide enough for us to peek into the past. The professor spread the finds on a canvas sheet. "This," he said, "is what makes a story." Ouranopithecus wasn't alone. It lived alongside grazers, predators, birds, reptiles. The balance of all these lives made the world they knew. I crouched beside the sheet, tracing the curve of the antelope bone with my eyes. For a moment, I could almost hear that lost world, the crunch of hooves in dry grass, the splash of a turtle sliding into a stream, the warning calls of birds when a predator moved nearby. That night, I lay awake again, but not from excitement about a single skull or tooth. This time, it was the picture forming in my head piece by piece of an entire landscape. I imagined walking with Ouranopithecus through a patch of forest, the air cooler in the shade, the ground soft with fallen leaves. Then stepping out into the grasslands, where the sun was fierce and the wind carried the smell of distant rain. I imagined how their eyes would scan the distance, always watching for movement, always listening. Maybe they even had ways of warning each other, short barks or gestures, though we could never know for sure. The next morning, the wind had dropped, leaving the air heavy and still. We returned to the gully and began working farther along the ancient river layer. It was Tarek who found the biggest surprise. He was clearing a patch near the base of the cut when he called out. When we came over, he pointed at something buried almost entirely in the sand, a long, curved shape with ridges along one edge. The professor knelt and brushed it carefully. "A lower jaw," he said. "Not Ouranopithecus. This is from a large herbivore, maybe an ancient ancestor of today's gazelles." The jaw was heavy, the teeth worn flat. Marco said animals like this would have been important to the predators of the time and maybe even to Ouranopithecus, if they scavenged now and then. By the end of the week, the gully had given us a mixed collection: bits of primate bone, antelope remains, carnivore teeth, turtle shell, and ancient plant material. The professor recorded everything with photographs and notes, measuring distances between finds. When I asked why it mattered where each thing was found, he said, "Position is everything. It tells us whether these creatures lived here together, whether they died here in the same moment, or whether their remains were carried here by wind and water." I hadn't thought of that before, that even after millions of years, the arrangement of bones could still tell a story. On our last evening at the site that week, we stood at the ridge, looking down at the gully. The sun was low, painting the land in gold and shadows. "You know," the professor said quietly, "the more we find, the more questions we have. That's the nature of science. We may never get the full picture, but every piece we uncover makes the past a little less silent." I thought about the bones, the teeth, the scraps of wood. They were more than just objects, they were echoes of lives, proof that our world had been many worlds before this one. And somewhere in those worlds, Ouranopithecus had left its footsteps, faint but still traceable if you knew how to look. The wind returned 2 days later, stronger than before. It came in gusts that rattled the dry seed heads and sent loose soil spiraling into the air. By mid-morning, the sky had that strange, pale brightness it gets when dust is everywhere, turning the sun into a dull coin. Professor Marco said we should check the cliffs east of the gully. Wind and rain hit them hardest, he explained. That means erosion, and erosion means fresh exposures. If there's anything hiding there, we might see it now. The walk to the cliffs was longer than I expected. We crossed a wide stretch of open grassland, where the ground crunched underfoot, and then climbed a slope scattered with jagged volcanic rock. The cliffs rose above us, tall walls of layered earth and stone, their faces streaked with colors from rust red to pale yellow. They looked like the pages of an ancient book, half torn open. The professor stopped at a section where the cliff face had recently crumbled, leaving a slope of loose soil at its base. We stood looking up at the layers. This, he said, pointing to a thick dark band halfway up, was once a forest floor. Above it grassland. Below it river sediments. Each layer is a world stacked on top of another. Tarek frowned. So, the bones could be in any of them. Marcos smiled. Exactly. But the trick is knowing which layer matches the time of Ouranopithecus. He pulled out a small notebook and flipped to a page covered in sketches and notes. From what we've seen in the gully, they were here around 9 million years ago. That layer, he pointed again to the dark band, is our best match. We began at the base, climbing carefully over the loose soil until we reached the dark band. It was about as thick as my arm and packed with small stones, bits of charcoal, and patches of hardened clay. The professor explained that the charcoal might mean ancient fires, maybe lightning strikes that burned part of the forest. I pictured Ouranopithecus watching flames in the distance, smelling smoke for the first time, maybe frightened but also curious. We worked in pairs, brushing and scraping along the band. The soil here was compact but crumbly, breaking apart in thin flakes. My hands got coated in the dark dust, which smelled faintly like wet earth even though it hadn't rained in weeks. It was mid-afternoon when I spotted something different. In the wall, just above my head, was a pale curve half hidden by dirt. I called the professor over, and he leaned in close, brushing with the gentlest strokes. A ridge appeared, then a hollow. Part of a skull, he said softly. Small. Could be a juvenile. Tarek's eyes widened. Like, a young Ouranopithecus. Possibly. Or another primate. But if it is Ouranopithecus, this is important. Juvenile remains are rare. They tell us about growth, diet, even social structure. The professor worked slowly, clearing the surrounding soil. More of the skull emerged, the curve of the cranium, part of the jaw. It was more delicate than the adult fragment we'd found before. We couldn't remove it right away, the cliff face made it tricky. Marcos used a small hammer and chisel to cut a neat block of soil around the skull, then wrapped the whole thing in plaster. We'll open it in the lab, he said. That way, we won't risk damaging the finer details. After that, we kept going along the same band. Before long, Tarek found part of a leg bone sticking out sideways from the wall. I uncovered several teeth nearby, one of them still embedded in a tiny jaw fragment. It began to feel like the cliff was holding more than just scattered pieces. These bones weren't spread wide like in the gully, they were clustered, as if they'd been buried together. The professor noticed too. This could be a death site, he said quietly. Maybe a group was caught here during a flood or landslide. The idea made my skin prickle. I looked at the layers above us, imagining tons of earth sliding down in a single moment, burying everything alive. What if this was a family? I asked before I could stop myself. Marcos didn't answer right away. He just kept working, his eyes fixed on the layer in front of him. Finally, he said, if it was, then what we're seeing now might be their last moment, frozen in time. We stayed at the cliffs until the light began to fade. The wind had eased, leaving the air still and warm. From where we stood, the land stretched in every direction, rolling hills, dry riverbeds, and far-off ridges fading into the haze. As we packed up, the professor turned to me. Tomorrow, we'll focus just on this band. If these remains are from the same event, we might learn how they died and how they lived. That night, I dreamed of standing at the foot of the cliffs 9 million years ago. The air was heavy with the smell of rain, and the ground trembled. I saw shapes like shadows moving frantically through the trees, climbing, leaping, then freezing as the hillside above them gave way. The sound of earth sliding was deafening. Then there was only silence. The next day, we returned early, carrying extra plaster and tools. The professor wanted to map the entire section before removing anything else. He measured the position of each bone, drawing it in his notebook with careful lines. The more we uncovered, the clearer the picture became: 3 skull fragments too small, 1 larger, several limb bones, a scattering of ribs, and teeth from at least 3 individuals. "They're all in the same layer," Marcos said, "within a few meters of each other. That's strong evidence they were buried at the same time." Tarek looked uneasy. "So, it really could have been a group." "Yes," the professor said, "and if that's true, we might be looking at one of the oldest family groups ever found for this species." Finding them together made me think differently about Ouranopithecus. Before, they'd been just shapes in my imagination moving through grass, climbing trees. But now, I could almost see them together, an adult watching over 2 young ones, maybe resting at the forest edge, unaware that danger was coming. The professor said studying the bones could reveal if the individuals were related, similar traits in teeth, for example, or signs of shared health problems. But even without those answers, I felt like I'd stumbled into the middle of their story. By the end of the week, the Cliff of Bones, as Tarek had started calling it, had yielded more than we expected. The remains were carefully wrapped and labeled, ready for transport. But before sealing the last crate, the professor let me hold one of the juvenile teeth. It was tiny, light as a seed, but when I looked at it, I imagined it in a living mouth, chewing, biting, maybe grinning in some long-forgotten moment. The professor's voice broke into my thoughts. "Every find like this is rare. But a group, that's something special. It tells us they didn't live alone. They had bonds. And maybe those bonds mattered as much to them as ours do to us." I thought about that the whole walk back. In my mind, the cliffs weren't just a wall of stone anymore, they were a snapshot of a moment when lives had crossed and ended together, leaving a whisper for us to find millions of years later. The crates from the Cliff of Bones didn't leave right away. Professor Marco said fossils had to be stabilized before traveling, sealed in plaster jackets, labeled, and stored so they wouldn't crack under their own weight. While we waited for a truck from the nearest research center, we used the time to start examining what we could. He set up a table in my uncle's courtyard, under the shade of the old mulberry tree. The table was covered with soft cloth, brushes, small picks, and bottles of clear liquid that smelled faintly like glue. One by one, he opened the plaster jackets with a chisel, peeling them away like the rind of a giant fruit. Inside, the bones lay just as we'd found them, still half wrapped in their protective layer of dirt. "This is where the real work begins," he told me. "Finding them is only step 1. Now we have to listen to what they're telling us." I laughed. "Bones don't talk." He smiled. "Not with words. But they carry signs, patterns, marks, shapes that tell their story. You just have to know how to read them." The first bone he cleaned was one of the juvenile skull fragments. Using a thin brush, he swept away the remaining soil until the smooth curve of the cranium showed clearly. "See this," he said, pointing to a faint line running across the bone. "That's a suture. It's not fully fused, which means this individual was still young when it died, maybe 6 or 7 years old in human terms." I bent closer. "So, like a kid." "Exactly," he said. And see here these small pits in the surface? That could mean anemia or some nutritional stress. Maybe there wasn't enough iron in their diet, or maybe illness kept them from getting enough food. I felt a little pang in my chest. It was strange to think of a creature from 9 million years ago being sick, strange, and somehow familiar. Next, he unwrapped a piece of jaw from the larger skull. The teeth were still set in place, worn smooth on top. He ran a thin probe along the edges. Flatware patterns, he murmured. Consistent with chewing tough plants, maybe seeds, nuts, fibrous leaves? Like what goats eat? Tarek asked. Somewhat, Marcos said. But also fruits when they could find them. Seasonal changes in diet would leave different marks on the enamel. He showed us faint scratches running in different directions on the teeth. See these? Vertical scratches suggest pulling leaves from stems. Horizontal ones could mean grinding seeds. Even after millions of years, the teeth remember. The most surprising find came when he examined one of the limb bones, part of a humerus from the smaller juvenile. He held it under the magnifying glass, frowning. This ridge is larger than I'd expect for a young individual, he said. It suggests strong muscles attached here. Maybe from climbing often. So they climb trees a lot? I asked. Almost certainly, he replied. Probably to escape predators, or to reach food. But the bone also has a faint line here, see? That's a healed fracture. This youngster broke their arm at some point, but lived long enough for it to mend. That made me pause. A broken arm in the wild could be dangerous. If they healed, maybe others helped them survive, sharing food, protecting them. That meant care. That meant connection. Later that afternoon, the professor began piecing together fragments of ribs, laying them out like a puzzle. One of them had faint puncture marks. Teeth marks? I guessed. Yes, he said. Small, sharp ones. Likely from a predator. Hard to say if this happened before or after death, but it tells us something important: these apes lived in a dangerous world. He explained that even if Ouranopithecus could climb, they weren't always safe. Leopards, large birds of prey, even ancient hyenas could threaten them. Staying in groups probably gave them better odds. By the third day, the table under the mulberry tree was crowded with labeled bones, each with a small note describing its features. The professor had drawn rough sketches of what the group from the cliff might have looked like: one adult, two juveniles, moving together through a mosaic of forest and grassland. These sketches, he said, aren't the truth, they're guesses. But they're built on evidence, bone structure, wear patterns, the other animals found nearby. Science is part fact, part careful imagination. I liked that idea. It meant you could picture the past without inventing it from nothing. The bones gave you the edges of the puzzle, and your mind filled in the middle. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the healed fracture on the juvenile's arm. It kept coming back to me, not just that it happened, but that they lived through it. I imagined a youngster struggling to climb after the injury, maybe moving slower, maybe falling behind. I imagined the adult, maybe a parent, waiting, slowing their pace so the little one could keep up. I didn't know if that really happened, but it felt possible. And if it did, then the story of Ouranopithecus wasn't just about survival. It was about care. The next morning, the truck arrived to take the crates to the research center. The driver was a tall man with sun-browned skin, and he handled the boxes like they were glass. We loaded them carefully, wrapping each in extra padding. Before the last crate went in, the professor handed me one of the small plaster jackets, empty now except for a few grains of ancient soil. "A little reminder," he said. "Not of the bones, but of the land they came from. Always remember the earth holds more stories than we'll ever uncover." I turned the plaster in my hands, feeling the rough edge where it had been cut open. It seemed like such a small thing to carry, but I knew I'd keep it. That evening, as the truck rumbled away toward the horizon, the hills felt quieter. Not empty, just as if something had shifted. The bones were gone, but the space they'd left in my mind was full. I could still see them, the adult, strong and watchful, the juveniles, one with a mended arm, one perhaps sick but still moving forward. They weren't just shapes in the dirt anymore. They had weight. They had presence. And somehow, I felt like I'd met them.